Matthew and Luke both use what's called the Q document or the Q gospel as a source when writing their own gospel accounts. What then are the M and the L gospels? Luke's gospel actually begins with him saying that many people have already written accounts of the life of Jesus Christ. Matthew and Luke also used Mark's gospel as a source when writing their own. These claims that are relatively common among biblical scholars, which I am not. I'm just a guy who is kind of well-read, and that's about as far as it goes. These are common though, if you delve into that world. So these are the things that we're going to very briefly discuss today. If you have not come and checked out the Discord, I recommend doing it. There's a link in the description of the video. We'll talk about all that later. Also, go subscribe to @Live Bible Study. This is where we read live and go through the Bible, extra canonical texts, as well as other ancient texts. Now on to the actual topics. I'm going to lay the foundation. These are things we need to know before we talk about the Q gospel, what that is, what M and L is, all that fun stuff. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these would be our canonical gospels, meaning they're the things that are in the Bible that you probably have in your house. Hopefully I'm not telling anybody something they don't already know with that. 3/4 of them are called the Synoptic Gospels, which means that they are similar to one another. The word synoptic comes from syn, meaning together, and opsis or opsis, meaning seen together. 1, 2, 3, very similar. The 4th is kind of an outlier, and we'll talk about that later too. The only thing you really need to know about these synoptic gospels is that they are the same core stories, oftentimes, not always, there are variations of course, in the same sequence, oftentimes, with details altered here and there. To display this, let's go over a few examples. So out of Matthew 9:27-31, we have healing 2 blind men, where 2 blind men follow Jesus calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." Jesus asks if they believe he can heal them, and when they affirm, he touches their eyes and they are healed. Jesus then instructs them not to tell anyone, and they go ahead and spread the news. Matthew 20:29-34, where as Jesus leaves Jericho, 2 blind men sitting by the roadside cry out to him, calling him Lord, Son of David, similarity. Despite the crowd rebuking them, they persist. Jesus then asks them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They request to see, and so he heals them out of compassion. Then we have Luke 18:35-43, where essentially a single blind man is sitting by the roadside as Jesus approaches Jericho. The man hears the crowd and learns Jesus is passing by, so he cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stops, asks what the man wants, and then heals him when he requests his sight. The man immediately receives his sight and praises God, and the people also glorify God. In these stories, the same events happen in the same order, by the same structure, with only slight variations of specific details. Another good example is the calming of the storm. This is found in Matthew 8, Mark 4, and Luke 8. In the story, we have Jesus calming the violent storm while he's on the boat with the disciples, demonstrating his authority over nature. While there are slight variations in wording, the central elements are consistent in all 3 of the gospel accounts. Now, moving on to why we're here. What is the Q document and why does it matter? It matters because, from what scholars say, Matthew and Luke, the gospel writers, obviously had some kind of source that they were pulling from. Matthew and Luke seemingly, and almost certainly from most scholars' accounts, had a copy of Mark individually, meaning each of them individually had it away from each other when they had written their gospel accounts. This has been extremely widely accepted among scholars for a very long time. However, Matthew and Luke both contain many sayings of Jesus that Mark did not have. A good example of this would be the Lord's Prayer. Therefore, what scholars kind of assume from this is that they do not believe Matthew had a copy of Luke's gospel, and they do not believe Luke had a copy of Matthew's gospel as a reference, but rather that each of them used a separate reference, individual and aside from one another. Obviously, this also means that we don't currently have access to whatever that document was. In the 19th century, scholars came up with a hypothetical document that they called the Q document, which comes from the word quelle, which means source. So this would be the two-source hypothesis. In the two-source hypothesis, we have Matthew and Luke at the bottom. We have Mark and Q at the top. In case you're not looking at the screen, Luke essentially pulls from Q and from Mark, but then there is additional information that we don't know where that comes from. Matthew, likewise, pulls from Mark largely, pulls from Q, but then also has a third source, and we don't know what that document is. The thing to remember is that whatever the third document Luke has, Matthew did not seem to have, and whatever the third document Matthew had, Luke does not seem to have. It's believed that Matthew and Luke both used Q because much of the text is either similar or literally identical, but not found in the Gospel of Mark or any other surviving text that we currently have access to. The problem is that Q does not account for enough, which then brings us to the M and L documents. Matthew specifically also has content that is not found in Mark or Q, and so another hypothetical document or documents was created by scholars. This document or document was called M for Matthew's source. Luke likewise has content that is not found in Mark or Q. Thus, scholarship has created another hypothetical document or documents, which they called L for Luke's source. In both cases, scholars are not sure whether these are single sources, multiple sources, a mixture of written and oral sources, or solely written texts. What they do know is that Matthew had an additional source that is unique to his gospel, and Luke had an additional source that was unique to his gospel. One thing that I alluded to at the beginning that is interesting that I feel like people ignore largely is that Luke admits that he had sources that he was pulling from. What he said in chapter 1 through 4 was, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Luke is very obviously and admittedly building atop previous texts and stories, but he tells us here that his aim is to produce an orderly, organized gospel. What scholars then assume is that he's probably referring to at least Q and Mark, but likely L or other texts and sources that we simply don't have access to today. So then when we pull in M and L, we end up with the four-source hypothesis, which again, if you're not watching the screen, Matthew pulls from Mark and Q. Matthew also pulls from M. Luke pulls from Mark and Q. Luke also pulls from L. Matthew does not seem to pull from L, and Luke does not seem to pull from M. M and L are independent to each of those specific gospels. In the spirit of keeping this short, we're going to end it right here with the obvious question. The obvious question that people ask then is, couldn't we just assume M and L were the original writing of Matthew and Luke? Why do we assume that they used a source and this wasn't them just writing? One of the biggest reasons is because Matthew and Luke, it seems odd that they would know this information, being so far removed from the events that they were writing about. Scholars assume that they originate from a written source because of how they're structured and how they were actually written. Then when you add in that Luke itself, the gospel writer there, tells us there were earlier documents already floating around and that he had access to them. This, again, is very widely accepted among biblical scholarship, and it's argued against by only the most extreme minority in the biblical scholarship world. Again, I want to just make very clear that I am not within the scholarship world. I have injected myself into it, but I'm not a part of it. So I'm doing the best I can with the information that I've got. I'm highly motivated. I just really love doing this stuff. So I'm not making assertions. I'm, again, just giving information that I have found that I believe to come from pretty reliable sources. At the very least, there are people who are smarter and more educated than me. As usual, though, I'm very curious about your opinion. Do you now think I'm more of a heretic than you already did? Are these things that you accept and now you're going to look into? Or are they things you just completely reject as nonsense and you think I'm just making all of this stuff up? If you do have a problem with any of this stuff or with me, I'd be happy to hear about it. That's what the comment section is for. You're safe to leave now, but if you're interested in our Discord server or the other stuff we do on YouTube, I'm going to play a short clip right now. Love y'all. Have a great day. One thing I've learned in going from vocational ministry to online social media type stuff is that if you're a critical thinking Christian and you're somebody who's not easily appeased with the answers that are often given in the church system, is that it's hard to find a place where you feel like critical thinking is actually happening. We have really attempted to solve this. We created a Discord server. The Discord server is linked in the description below. It is free. It will always be free. From there, it's kind of our base station. We do a ton of live streams every week on 2 different YouTube channels, the one you're watching right now, as well as at Live Bible Study. If you choose to give it a shot, you can always leave if you don't like it. We have an events page where you can see when, as well as where, the live streams are. We study everything from the Canon to apocryphal texts to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Our goal is to get as much context as humanly possible, whether it's from the Bible itself or it's from outside texts. Outside of that, it's really just become a fun, dysfunctional, weird family of people who all gather together to discuss things that are highly intellectual and also just kind of be weird. But it has truly become like a second family. I don't know what I would do if all of a sudden everything here disappeared. If you've been looking for some kind of community to enter into, somewhere to go where people are talking literally 24/7, and that also does a bunch of live streaming where you can come on and talk with your voice, you would just join the call-in voice during the podcast and you'd be able to come on and chat with us. If you're interested, give it a shot, and then go subscribe to @Live Bible Study on YouTube. Turn on notifications so you can come try out the live streams too, and just see if it's right for you.